How many of you today turned on your smartphone and checked the news of what's happening in Gaza? That's what I thought. It's truly an honor to be with you all here tonight. Like many of you, my heart is weighed down so heavily by the ongoing turmoil in Gaza. And every day, as we all witness in absolute horror what Israel is doing to Palestinians as it commits war crime after war crime, watching dismembered children with their limbs blown off or helpless fathers carrying their decapitated babies while collecting the body parts of their children in plastic bags, or mothers carrying the dead bodies of their children, screaming, crying for them to just wake up, or the newlywed wife who embraces her dead husband, her lover. She gives him one last kiss and hug goodbye. It almost feels like we are watching a sadistic horror movie right on the screens of our smartphones, but we're not. We are watching in real time a genocide unfold before our eyes. And the death toll stands stark and horrific. Over 20,000 Palestinians have been killed by merciless bombs, guided missiles, and white phosphorus. Weapons handed directly to an out-of-control apartheid state by our own government and paid for by our taxpayer money. If anything good has come out of this horrific war, it's that the moral depravity of the so-called rules-based order has been exposed to the masses. The mask has fallen from the neoliberal class. For far too long, liberal Western politicians have tried to convince us that they live by the standards of human rights, democracy, and freedom of speech. These are the same individuals and countries that say Israel has a right to defend itself against the world's largest concentration camp. Our so-called Western leaders in Washington, in London, in Brussels have weaponized human rights. They've weaponized democracy to promote humanitarian wars and to expand their settler colonial projects. But let's not forget that this is the same ruling class that brought us the wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Somalia. And they're the same ruling class that have given us and pushed for the brutal maximum pressure campaigns, sanctions, and regime change operations against sovereign countries like Syria, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and so many more countries who are resisting Western imperialism. Israel's war in Gaza is just an outward and blatant expression and representation of what the neoliberal class represent. A bloodthirst for war that fuels the military-industrial complex. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, two weapons manufacturers, applaud this genocide. Think tanks that are funded by these weapon manufacturers draft the war policies and hand them to our politicians to make these wars inevitable. We see dead children. They see their stock prices go up. But it's clear, no matter how many millions of dollars that they spend to manufacture consent for their wars and support for Israeli apartheid, Palestinians have won the hearts and minds of humanity. Never have I personally seen in my lifetime such global dissent and awakening to Israel's propaganda war in Gaza. We are witnessing a global enlightenment. Millions upon millions of people have taken to the streets. Mass sit-ins at our elected officials' offices have been organized, and mass boycotts of monolithic corporations. The massive coffee company Starbucks lost $12 billion in a matter of just 1 month from our global boycott campaign. We have to disrupt their money-making mechanisms that make these wars possible. The capitalist system that we live under today is meant to make us feel powerless, but we have the power in our hands to disrupt their money-making mechanisms and stop this war. And guess what? It's working, and Israel knows it. The architects of the wars know this. And that's why today, Israel is spending literally millions of dollars on propaganda, on an information war to manufacture consent. But it's also, through this, systematically targeting Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Today, over 100 Palestinian journalists have been killed so far in less than 70 days of its onslaught. These courageous individuals committed to unveiling the truth have become direct targets of a regime so desperate to cloak its genocidal actions from the world's scrutiny. Israel doesn't want the world to see the reality of its genocidal onslaught in Gaza, so it's assassinating the messengers one by one along with their families. In most parts of the world, wearing a flak jacket marked press gives you protection. But now in Gaza, it may as well be a target, as Israel has turned Gaza into what the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has called a cemetery for journalists. And you'd think mainstream corporate journalists would talk about the targeting of their fellow brethren in Gaza. But they're not. If legacy media outlets like the New York Times, like CNN, cover Palestinian journalists killed in Gaza, they don't even have the basic journalistic integrity to say who killed them, and fail to point out that Israel is systematically targeting them. We don't have a mainstream media anymore in this country. We have an extremist media beating the drums of war. Corporate media are whitewashing Israeli crimes and playing the fool, pretending not to understand where the missiles are coming from. They pretend not to hear the genocidal rhetoric emanating from Tel Aviv, who are openly and blatantly calling Palestinians subhuman who need to be cleansed out of Gaza, citing Amlak. Brave journalists in Gaza have lost their lives to document the Israeli onslaught. And we are not just numbers, we have names. We will not forget Palestinian journalist Ayat Khudari, who was killed in her home by an Israeli airstrike. In her last message to the world, she posted on her Instagram saying, "We used to have big dreams, but now our dream is to be killed in one piece so that they know who we are." Today, my dear friend and colleague journalist Mu'taz Azaiza has chronicled with full transparency the horrors of life under incessant bombs. Every day we check our phones to see if Mu'taz has posted. Every day we check our phones to see if Bisan has posted. Hey world, it's Bisan, I'm still alive. And people around the world are flocking to their pages to get live coverage of the war because it's become evident that the Western corporate media are biased towards Israeli apartheid, pushing atrocity propaganda about October 7th to justify Israel's genocide. Stories of beheaded babies and mass rapes, many of which have been retracted. Western media leave out the context that Israel is occupying Palestinian land and fail to mention the many crimes against humanity Israel is committing every single day according to the Geneva Convention. And it's no coincidence. This is by design. Let's take the New York Times, for example. Organizations like the New York Times Bureau, Jerusalem Bureau, is actually built on a Palestinian house in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, which belongs to a noted Palestinian writer named Gaza. She's a survivor of the Nakba. The New York Times also cooperates directly with Israeli officials by receiving and obeying gag orders from the Israeli government on what they can and cannot report about Israel and Palestine. The New York Times bureau chiefs, Ethan Bronner, Isabel Kirshner, and David Brooks, all three of them have had their children, their adult children, enlisted in the Israeli army while they actively were covering Palestine and Israel for the newspaper. The so-called paper of record never made this public to its readers until this day, raising serious questions of bias and a conflict of interest. Now, the New York Times has a long history of firing journalists, including Gaza-based photographer Hussam Salim, following a direct order and pressure from an Israeli lobby group named Honest Reporting. And CNN and others who are right now embedded with the Israeli military have to get their footage approved by the Israeli military before publishing it. Now, these are just two very minor examples that doesn't even scratch the surface of how other media outlets work directly with Israel, directly with the national security state, directly with weapons manufacturers and special interest groups to control the narrative about Palestine and most wars. This doesn't even begin to scratch the surface on how big tech work with NATO directly and Israeli-funded think tanks like the Atlantic Council and the Anti-Defamation League, or better known as the ADL, to crack down on alternative information on social media platforms. We are living in a modern-day information war. But let's consider this. Mu'taz Azaiza, which I know you're all familiar with, how many followers does he now have on Instagram? He has nearly 18 million followers on Instagram, and he amassed that following within 60 days. The New York Times has 9.4 million digital subscribers, and this newspaper has been around for a very, very long time. So what does this tell us? It tells us that we are winning the information war, and people are breaking through the propaganda. Journalists like Mu'taz Azaiza, Yunus Tirawi, Muhammad Ismiri, Mu'tasim Murtaja, Wa'el Dahduh, Hind Khudari, Bisan, just to name a few. They're showing us in real time the courage it often takes to be a journalist. Many of the mainstream corporate journalists haven't even entered Gaza, and they're reporting about the crisis comfortably from neighboring countries in Jordan and Egypt and Lebanon. Now, as Israel continues to pound Gaza, and we continue to see the images of death, of blood, and of destruction, it's really, really easy to feel a sense of hopelessness. It's easy to be left speechless. What more can we say? I remember turning on my phone and seeing images of babies with their organs splattered out of them and thinking, I don't know what else to say. I have no more words. And I know that many of you have felt this way as well. But our story doesn't end here. For every bomb dropped, every child left to survive but orphaned, every orphan child that's left with its limbs blown off, every person pulled from under the rubble but has been left to survive but horrified. We are the survivors, and our existence is our resistance. Israel thought it could bury us, but we turned out to be seeds. I, too, was once that little girl who sat on her rooftop in Shafat al-Quds, who watched in horror Israeli jets bomb homes in Ramallah. I was once, too, that little girl who sat in her classroom only to look around to find my classmates missing each day, empty seats around me at 11 years old because they were either killed or blocked from crossing a checkpoint to get to school. I too was once that little girl who was too afraid to look outside her window as Israeli soldiers pointed their rifles toward us during a militarized curfew. I too was once that little girl who had her water cut off and had to hide in her barricaded home so that Israeli settlers wouldn't come inside and attack her family. By 13 years old, I had already witnessed human rights abuses by a state that had convinced the world that it was a civilized democracy. No child should have seen what I had seen, let alone what the children of Gaza are seeing today. By 13 years old, I had already witnessed Palestinians subjected to discriminatory laws, having their travel controlled, living behind a 30-foot tall concrete apartheid wall separating us from the rest of the world. Every single day was a matter of survival while living under martial law and occupation. When I finally moved back to the United States when I was 13 years old, to the pristine suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the lawns were always perfectly mowed and green, life was certainly much calmer here. But my mind at 13 years old was racing with thoughts of children being killed by bombs. My mind was racing, thinking about the families left homeless from airstrikes, how their electricity and water were being cut off. I couldn't stop thinking about the men and young boys, some who I knew personally, who were abducted by Israeli police in the middle of the night raids and held in indefinite detention without charge or trial. I could not unsee what I had seen. But little did I know that moving overseas to Palestine as an American child would shape not only my perspective on the world, but how the media operates. You see, when we moved back to the US in 2001, it was just a few months before 9/11. I was absolutely traumatized by the horrors I had witnessed as a preteen in Palestine. I suffered from what soldiers who fight in wars suffer from when they return home from war. I suffered from PTSD, from severe anxiety, and of course, survivor's guilt. I was just 13 years old and felt like no one could understand what I had just witnessed. While most teenagers in America were worried about football games, shopping, partying, girlfriend, boyfriends, I turned to the media to stay up to date of the war I could not let go of. But what I got was devastating. When I turned to CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and I opened the newspapers up of the New York Times and the Washington Post, All I got were images of Palestinian men covering their faces, bearing guns, stoking that fear in the hearts of Americans while framing Palestinians as the aggressors. Media outlets like CNN and MSNBC at that time gave Israeli leaders and political figures and special interest people who were paid for by the millions of dollars and big salaries by the Israeli lobby, they gave them unlimited airtime space on their networks to spew dehumanizing rhetoric about Palestinians and how much we hated ourselves, that we want our children to die. The media instilled fear in the hearts and minds of Americans to paint us as savages and barbaric, to help justify Israel's apartheid and fascist policies on a defenseless population. And why wouldn't they? The US right now gives Israel over $10.4 million a day. That's right, a day to the apartheid regime. And after 9/11, the media propaganda machine went on full steroids to dehumanize Muslims altogether as barbaric and painted a caricature of us that we were fighting jihad. And this was used to justify the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that have left over 4 million people dead. So it became very clear to me at 13 years old that Americans' lack of understanding about the world was because of one thing, and that was the media. And it's as if they were all given the same script to talk about wars overseas. It's no wonder that 6 corporations right now own 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. Americans today are the most propagandized people on the planet, and I don't say that lightly. Now, despite feeling alone and traumatized and misunderstood, and at times almost losing hope when I was 13 years old, having lived under this Israeli occupation and now living in a post-9/11 world, post-9/11 America, watching in horror on my TV screen at that time, US bombs being dropped on Iraq and Afghanistan, and seeing the blood-drenched mothers carrying their children in those countries. It was this rock bottom place where I found my courage and my catharsis to pursue journalism, to speak up not just for Palestinians, but for all people around the world. It was at 13 years old that I decided to become a journalist. And in 2009, against all odds, I became the first American woman to wear the hijab while anchoring and reporting the news in the US, in a post-9/11 America that told me that no one would hire me because I wore the hijab. While I thought this was a great accomplishment at the time, because I wanted to break barriers and show people what a Muslim woman could accomplish and be that voice within mainstream corporate media, I soon realized that very little change could be made within corporate media. Very little. Even local media, news is directed, all of it is directed by marketing strategies and not actual journalism. And I would soon just be used as the face of diversity at these stations while pushing very dumbed down stories to the masses. And this is exactly why, at the age of 24 years old, I started MintPress. About 10 years later, MintPress is now a leading independent investigative news outlet in this country and around the world that exposes the profiteers of the war machine. Our investigations have been cited by politicians, by major news organizations, academic journals, books, and much more across the globe. Our reporting has been used in negotiations between the United States and Russia that helped stop a full-blown US invasion on Syria. But this route hasn't been an easy one. My name has been dragged through the mud, and I have been labeled and I have been smeared. I've appeared on the front pages of media outlets with my face plastered next to Bashar al-Assad, calling me an agent of Iran, of Hamas, you name it. Because when you stand up for war, against war, you will find that the only way to silence your message and your truthful reporting is not through information or facts, but it's through McCarthyist smears. And because I am Palestinian, and because I am a woman, and because I wear the hijab, I became an easy target. MintPress has been targeted financially. We know through leaked emails directly by British intelligence who ordered PayPal to ban our outlet. We've been banned by TikTok, and our Wikipedia page has been written and edited time and time again, almost on a weekly basis for the last decade by literal Israel lobby groups. I have lost friends on the way and have had my own family turn against me for standing staunchly against wars of attrition and not falling for sectarian division pushed by mainstream media. But all of this is by design. It's a psychological war against the truth tellers, to intimidate us to stop, to push us into a corner and isolate us, to make us feel like we are all alone and that we are losing, to make us feel small. But no matter the information war waged against us, we will not back down because there are literal innocent lives at stake who need us to be their voice. Journalism became my personal outlet for the helplessness that I felt growing up when I suffered from PTSD, the trauma that I carry because of my life in a war zone, and knowing that so many people I left behind in Palestine, they're still suffering. Whether it be in Gaza or anywhere else in the world suffering under war. Israel thought it could bury us, but we turned out to be seeds.